"It is better to be feared than loved if you cannot be both," said Niccolo Machiavelli. To be able to say such a thing, you should be really cold and ruthless. But was he as cold and ruthless as people say? In this video, we will look at who Machiavelli really was, what he wrote, and how his ideas still affect the world today. Machiavelli was born in Florence on the 3rd of May, 1469. His family wasn't super rich, but they were well respected. His father was a lawyer, which meant Machiavelli grew up surrounded by books and ideas. This was a big deal because back then not many people had access to education. So he was taught grammar, rhetoric, and Latin by his teacher. Also, it is unknown whether Machiavelli knew Greek. Florence was at the time one of the center of Greek scholarship in Europe. These all made him remarkably fortunate for his time. Florence during Machiavelli's time was like the New York City of the Renaissance, busy, wealthy, and full of drama. It was a city-state, meaning it ruled itself, but it was also constantly fighting with other city-states like Milan, Venice, and Rome. Oh, and let's not forget the powerful families, like the Medici, who basically ran the show. Florence was a republic, which means it was supposed to be ruled by the people. But in reality, powerful families like the Medici controlled everything. Machiavelli grew up watching this back and forth between republics and dictatorships. It was a time of constant power struggles, alliances, and betrayals. Now let's imagine living in a world where one day your city is free and the next day a powerful family takes over. You had to use politics wisely to survive. That was Machiavelli's reality, and it shaped how he saw politics. After the Medici family was pushed from power in 1494, Machiavelli was appointed to a Florentine government office where he authored government documents. In 1498, at the age of 29, he got his big break. He was appointed to Second Chancery, which was one of two key state departments in Florence. He also became Secretary of the Ten of War. This was a committee that dealt with foreign relations and war preparations. This was a huge deal because it gave him a first-hand look at how politics really worked. His job was to negotiate with other city-states and powerful leaders. He was out there meeting kings, popes, and generals. He saw how they made decisions, how they lied, and how they used force to get what they wanted. He would travel the world, meet with powerful people, and take notes. He was very happy with his life, but there was a hidden danger that he couldn't see. The Medici family hadn't gone for forever. As a result, in 1512, everything changed. The Medici family, who had been kicked out of Florence, came back to power. And guess what? They didn't like Machiavelli. He was fired, arrested, and even tortured. Now let's stop for a second and imagine going from being a top diplomat to being thrown in prison. Everything you've made in your life was taken from you unfairly. Your job, your money, your status in society, everything was gone. And yet you have a family to take care. It was definitely a rough time for Machiavelli. After his release from the jail, Machiavelli was forced to live in the countryside, far from the political action he loved. But he didn't waste his time. He started writing not just about politics, but also plays, poems, and histories. The Prince is his most famous work, but he also wrote discourses on Livy, where he argued that republics are better than dictatorships. Wait, what? Isn't that the opposite of the Prince? Well, Machiavelli was a complicated guy. He believed that while a strong ruler might be necessary in some situations, a republic was the best way to ensure long-term stability. The quote at the beginning of the video, which was, "It is better to be feared than loved if you cannot be both," is from The Prince. Machiavelli wrote this book as a guide for rulers on how to gain and keep power. He says that if a ruler must choose, it is safer to be feared. People might stop loving you, but they'll obey you if they're afraid of the consequences. And it keeps them loyal. But he also warned, don't go too far. If a ruler is too cruel, they'll become hated, and that can lead to rebellion. The key is to balance fear with respect. Another famous idea from The Prince is that the ends justify the means. In other words, if your goal is important enough, like keeping your country stable, then it's okay to use harsh or even unethical methods to achieve it. But this doesn't mean Machiavelli thought being ruthless was good. He was just being realistic. In his view, politics is a dirty game, and sometimes you have to play dirty to win. Machiavelli also said a good leader must be both a lion and a fox. The lion represents strength and power, while the fox represents cunning and intelligence. In other words, a leader needs to be strong enough to intimidate enemies, but also smart enough to avoid traps and outthink their opponents. Machiavelli believed that the world is constantly changing, and a good leader must be able to adapt. What works today might not work tomorrow, so a ruler needs to be flexible and ready to change their strategy. This is why he said, "Never attempt to win by force what can be won by deception." Sometimes being clever is better than being strong. Many people think The Prince is a book about being cruel, but Machiavelli was not trying to make rulers evil. He was simply describing how power worked in the real world. He lived in a dangerous time where leaders were often killed or overthrown. In his eyes, survival was more important than being nice. Even though The Prince was written over 500 years ago, its lessons are still relevant today. Leaders around the world still face the same challenges Machiavelli wrote about: how to gain power, how to keep it, and how to deal with enemies. That's why politicians, business leaders, and military strategists study it to understand power and strategy. Of course, not everyone agrees with Machiavelli's ideas. Some people think his advice is too harsh or unethical. But whether you love him or hate him, there's no denying that The Prince forces us to think deeply about power and leadership. The Machiavellian word is now used to describe people who are clever, manipulative, and willing to do anything to win. But was Machiavelli really that kind of person? Or was he just telling the hard truth about leadership? You can explain your thoughts on the comments section. Also, I made a video about Genghis Khan. Can we say he was a Machiavellian? You better decide after watching that video. See you in the next one.